Hello and welcome, dear students, to this lecture on evolution of comparative politics as an academic discipline. The objectives of this lecture are: number 1, provide an overview of the evolution of comparative politics; 2, know about the state of discipline before World War II; 3, briefly highlight the nature of comparative politics after World War II; highlight the emergence of new trends in post 1970s phase, and finally discuss the current state of discipline. Dear students, the study of comparative politics became highly significant in the 1950s. A good number of leading American political scientists sought to transform the field of study. They changed the orientation and nomenclature of the discipline. For example, there was a shift from the study of foreign to comparative political phenomena and from the study of governments to the study of political systems. Broadly speaking, the transformation which has taken place over a period of time has been from a field which would most appropriately be labeled as the study of foreign governments to the one which might most adequately be called as comparative political systems. However, the historical development of the academic field of comparative politics may be roughly put into two major phases. One, the pre-World War II phase, and the post-World War II phase. For clearer understanding, the post-war phase can be divided into three main subphases. That is, first, late 1940s to 1960s, second, the 1970s phase, and third, the post-80s phase to present. Now, dear students, let us talk about the pre-World War II phase. In its earliest incarnation, the comparative study of politics was introduced to us in the form of studies carried out by the Greek philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle studied constitutions of around 150 states and classified them into a topology of regimes. His classification was presented in terms of both descriptive and normative categories. He not only described and classified regimes and political systems in terms of their types, that is, democracy, aristocracy, monarchy, and so on, but also distinguished them on the basis of certain norms of good governance. On the basis of this comparison, he divided regimes into good and bad, ideal and perverted. These Aristotelian categories were acknowledged and taken up by Romans such as Polybius and Cicero, who considered them in formal and legalistic terms. Concern for comparative study of regime types reappeared in the 15th century with Machiavelli. So, the contribution of great scholars like Aristotle, Machiavelli, Tocqueville, Bryce and Weber belong to this phase in the evolution of the field of comparative politics. The discipline of comparative politics, as one would call it in its early stage, was highly speculative and normative, mostly sort of ethnocentric. Comparison in this phase was used mostly in an anecdotal way. There was hardly any attempt for a systematic comparison over time. These thinkers utilized comparative method for the primary purpose of better understanding the working of political organizations. The major concern was to analyze the nature and quality of political regimes, the behavior of rulers and their relationship with the ruled, the manner in which rules are determined, made and executed, the way in which conflicts are decided or arbitrated, the condition of political stability and the causes of change, and the factors affecting political decisions and the values held by political communities. But very little attention was paid to the informal arrangements of the society and their role in the exercise of political power and decision making, or to the political processes and political behavior of the individual and groups. Pre-modern comparisons were mostly aiming at classification of the whole political order, that is, the polity. Comparisons were rather simple typologies, such as those of counting the number of rulers. Many of them contained normative assumptions. So, the preoccupation with philosophical and speculative questions concerning the good order or the ideal state, and in the process the use of abstract and normative vocabulary, persisted in comparative studies of the late 19th and early 20th century. The late 19th and early 20th century signified the period when liberalism was the reigning ideology and European countries enjoyed dominance in the world politics. The rest of the world, that is Asia, Africa and Latin America, were either European colonies or under their sphere of influence as ex-colonies. The most remarkable comparative studies of this period include James Bryce's Modern Democracies, published in 1921, Hermann Finner's Theory and Practice of Modern Governments, published in 1932, Carl J. Friedrich's Constitutional Government and Democracy, published in 1937, and Robert Mitchell's Political Parties, 1915. These studies, however, were largely concerned with the comparative study of institutions, the distribution of power, and the relationship between different layers of government. These studies were Eurocentric, that is, confined to the study of institutions, governments and regime types in the European countries like Britain, France, Germany and so on. So, we can say that these studies were in fact not genuinely comparative in the sense that they excluded from their analysis a large number of countries. Any generalization derived from a study confined to a few countries could not legitimately claim having validity for the rest of the world. So, dear students, it may be emphasized here that exclusion of the rest of the world was symptomatic of the dominance of Europe in the world politics, which however was on the wane and shifting gradually to North America. It is worth remembering that the comparative study of governments till the 1940s was predominantly the study of institutions, the legal constitutional principles regulating them, and the manner in which they functioned in Western European liberal democracies. Some of the key features and characteristics of the traditional or pre-war comparative politics that can sum up the evolution of discipline in this phase are: number 1, the scholars of sub-discipline put almost exclusive emphasis on the study of governmental structures and the formal organizations of the state institutions. 2, the subject was discussed in a purely descriptive, historical or a legalistic manner. It had thus adopted a rather limited methodology. 3, government studied were smaller in number, all falling in a single cultural pattern. The discipline during this period was non-comparative, descriptive, parochial and static. 4th, the focus was on Western European democracies. Comparative politics at this time was mainly normative in nature. There was an emphasis on the study of formal institutions to the neglect of political processes. Further, it was focused on the Western European political system, and thus the non-Western political systems were neglected. So, we can say that it was culture bound. There was an emphasis on description of the existing institutions with little attention given to the analysis and development of systemic generalization about the political phenomena. Again, there was a lack of concern for the development of theories through collection and analysis of data in order to test specific hypotheses. Further, there was a neglect of the findings of other social sciences having bearing on the political phenomena. Therefore, the discipline during this stage showed insensitiveness to non-political determinants of political behavior and thus to the non-political basis of governmental institutions. Similarly, the comparative politics of this time has been considered as comparative government. Now, dear students, we will come to the post-World War II phase, and as already stated, it can be subdivided into three subphases. So, first is the post-World War subphase, that is late 1940s to late 1960s. So, the challenges and limitations of the pre-war comparative politics and research as well as methodology paved the way for more sophisticated use of methods and techniques to enrich the field of study. As already discussed, that the comparative study of governments till the 1940s was predominantly the study of institutions, the legal constitutional principles regulating them, and the manner in which these institutions and regulations functioned in Western liberal democracies. So, a powerful critique of the institutional approach emerged in the mid 1950s. The critique had its roots in behavioralism, which had emerged as a new movement in the discipline of political science, aiming to provide scientific rigor to the discipline and develop a science of politics. Although we will have separate discussions on behavioralism and many other concepts and aspects in the subsequent lectures, suffice to state here that behavioral movement was concerned with developing an inquiry which was quantitatively based on survey techniques involving the examination of empirical facts separated from values to provide value neutral, non-prescriptive, objective observations and explanations. The behavioralists attempted to study social reality by seeking answers to the questions like, politically speaking, why people behave as they do and why, as a result, political processes and systems function as they do. It is these why questions regarding differences in public behavior and their implication for political processes and political systems which shifted the focus of comparative study away from the legal formal aspect of institutions. In the 1950s and 60s, a number of distinguished scholars such as Harold Lasswell and Gabriel Almond took on the task of carving out and establishing the field of comparative politics. Their basic task was to distinguish it from political theory on the one hand and from international relations and area studies on the other. Comparative politics was described as different from political theory as it involved not only theorizing but also classifying, categorizing and discovering relationships among variables, hypothesis building and empirically testing. It was suggested that circular relationship can be visualized between theory and comparative politics. Comparative research begins by taking a fairly established theory, testing it empirically in the field in a number of situations and then refining the theory again in the light of the findings. Many theoretical tools such as party system, federalism, parliamentary system and so on were formulated in this manner. In 1955, Roy McCreadis criticized the existing comparative studies for various reasons like privileging formal institutions over non-formal political processes or for being descriptive rather than analytical as well as case study oriented rather than genuinely comparative. Whereas Harry Eckerstein points out that the changes in the nature and scope of comparative politics in this period showed sensitivity to the changing politics, while at the same time urging the need to reconceptualize the notion of politics and develop paradigms for large scale comparisons. Rejecting the traditional and almost exclusive emphasis on the Western world, Gabriel Almond and his colleagues of the American Social Science Research Council's Committee on Comparative Politics attempted to develop a theory and a methodology which could encompass and compare political systems of all kinds as primitive or advanced, democratic or non-democratic, Western or non-Western. The notion of politics at this period was broadened by the emphasis on the concept of realism or politics of practice. The scope of the study widened and focus shifted to the functioning of less formally structured agencies, behaviors and processes like the political parties, interest groups, elections, voting behavior, attitudes and so on. With decline in the attention from studies of formal institutions, there was simultaneously a decline in the centrality of the notion of state itself. The emergence of a large number of countries necessitated the development of frameworks which could facilitate comparisons on a large scale. This led to the emergence of inclusive and abstract notions like the political system. This notion of system replaced the notion of the state. It enabled scholars to take into account the extra legal, social and cultural institutions which were crucial to the understanding of non-Western politics. It also had an added advantage of including in its scope pre-state or non-state societies as well as roles and offices which were not seen as overtly connected with the state. Also, with the change of emphasis to actual practices and functioning of institutions, the problems of research came to be defined not in terms of what legal powers these institutions had, but what they actually do, how they were related to one another and what roles they play in the making and execution of public policy. This led to the emergence of structural functionalism, in which certain functions were described as being necessary to the societies and the execution and performance of these functions were then compared across a variety of different formal and informal structures. According to Howard J. Vyarda, in the period of 1960s, the new nations became for most of these scholars the living laboratories for the study of social and political change. It was during this period that some of the most innovative and exciting theoretical and conceptual approaches were advanced in the field of comparative politics. These were study of political culture, political socialization, developmentalism, dependency and interdependency, corporatism, bureaucratic authoritarianism and later transitions to the democracy. The modern period or the post-war phase of comparative analysis has also seen the mushrooming of various universalistic models. These include David Easton's political system theory, Karl Dach's social mobilization theory, Shelley's center and periphery, and theories of modernization by Apter, Roken and so on. The theory of political development by Almond, Coleman, Pye and Verba also claimed universal relevance. According to Verda, developmentalism was perhaps the dominant conceptual paradigm of this time. To a considerable extent, the interest in developmentalism emanated from US foreign policy interests in developing countries to counter the appeals of Marxism, Leninism. Now, we come to the second subphase, that is 1970s and beyond. Now, towards the 1970s, developmentalism came to be criticized for favoring abstract models which flattened out differences among specific political, social and cultural systems in order to study them within a single universistic framework. This critique emphasized the ethnocentrism of these models and focused on the third world in order to work out a theory of underdevelopment. So, dear students, they stressed the need to concentrate on looking for solutions to the backwardness of developing countries. Two main challenges to developmentalism which arose in the early 1970s and gained widespread attention were A. Dependency and B. Corporatism. Dependency theory criticized the dominant model of developmentalism for ignoring number 1, domestic class factors and second, international market and power factors in development. It was particularly critical of the US foreign policy and multinational corporations and suggested, contrary to what was held true in developmentalism, that the development of already industrialized nations and that of the developing ones could not go together. Instead, dependency theory argued that the development of the West had come on the shoulders and at the cost of non-West. The idea that the diffusion of capitalism promotes underdevelopment and not development in many parts of the world was embodied in Andre Gunder Frank's Capitalism and Underdevelopment in Latin America that was published in 1967. Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, published in 1972, and Malcolm Caldwell's The Wealth of Some Nations, published in 1979. The Marxist critique of the dependency theory, however, pointed out that the nature of exploitation through surplus extraction should not be seen simply on national lines. Instead, it must be looked as part of more complex pattern of alliances between the metropolitan bourgeois of the core and the indigenous bourgeois of the periphery or the satellite, as they operate in a worldwide capitalist system. So, the corporatist approach criticized developmentalism for its Euro-American ethnocentrism and indicated that there were alternative organic corporatist or authoritarian ways to organize the state and state-society relations. All this further broadened the scope of the discipline. Now, the third subphase is the post-1980s phase. During the later 1970s and early 1980s, number of theories and new subject matter emerged in the field of comparative politics against the existing theories of modernization, developmentalism and behavioralism. These theories included bureaucratic authoritarianism, systems theory, transition to democracy, neoliberalism and the politics of structural adjustment. The postmodern era challenged all the earlier established models of knowledge and understanding of behavioral period. It claimed that social facts are social constructs. While some scholars saw these developments as undermining and breaking the unity of the field, which was being dominated by developmentalism, others saw them as adding healthy diversity, providing alternative approaches and covering new subject areas. Gabriel Almond, who had argued in the late 1950s that the notion of the state should be replaced by the political system, which was adaptable to scientific inquiry, and Easton, who undertook to construct the parameters and concepts of a political system, continued to argue well into 1980s on the importance of political system as the core of political study. The state, however, started receiving its share of attention in the 1960s and 1970s in Latin America, especially in Argentina, in the works of Guillermo Ordinel's Economic Modernization and Bureaucratic Authoritarianism, that was published in 1973, Rolf Miliband's The State in Capitalist Societies 1969, Nicholas Polenza's State Power Socialism published in 1978, as well as in such works of political sociologists like Bringing the State Back published in 1985. The idea was to restore focus onto the state. Globalization and other emerging trends in 1980s led to a complete shift in comparative political analysis. Much of the development of comparative political analysis in this period can be seen in terms of number 1, ever widening range of countries being included for the study, 2, more variables being added to the models such as policy, ideology, governing experiences and so on. There has been a move away from general theory to emphasis on relevance of context. In part, this tendency reflects the renewed influence of historical inquiry in the social sciences and especially the emergence of a historical sociology, which tries to understand phenomena in a very broad or holistic context within which they occur. There has been a shying away from models to a more in-depth understanding of particular countries and cases where more qualitative and contextualized data can be assessed and where account can be taken of specific institutional circumstances or particular political cultures. Hence, we see a new emphasis on more culturally specific studies, for example, English speaking countries, Arab world and so on, and nation specific countries like America, India, China, etc., and eventually institutionally specific countries, for example, India under a particular regime. The disintegration of Soviet Union brought into currency the notion that there is an end of ideological war with the end of communist ideology. Francis Fukuyama, in his article The End of History published in 1989, which was later developed into a book titled as The End of History and the Last Man published in 1992, argued that the history of ideas had ended with the recognition and triumph of liberal democracy as the final form of human government. It was argued that with the end of communist ideology, the Western liberal democracy has become dominating ideology to form governments. Most of the developed and developing nations adopted liberal democratic form of government. If there are on the one hand studies conforming to the contemporary interest of Western capitalism seeking to develop market democracy, there are also a number of studies which take into account the resurgence of people's movements seeking autonomy, right to indigenous culture, movements of tribals, Dalits, women's movements and the environmental movement. These movements reveal a terrain of contestation where the interests of capital are in conflict with people's rights and represent the language of change and liberation in an era of global capital. Thus, concerns with issues of identity, environment, ethnicity, gender, race and so on have provided a new dimension to the comparative political analysis. And dear students, finally, the significant aspect of the trajectory of comparative politics during this latest phase has been the unprecedented developments in the field of information and communication technology like the internet and the World Wide Web. This has made the production, collection and analysis of data easier and also assured their faster and wider diffusion worldwide. These developments have not only enhanced the availability of data, but also made possible the emergence of new issues and themes which extend beyond the confines of the nation state. These new themes in turn form an important influential aspect of the political environment in the contemporary globalized world. Thus, the discipline of comparative politics had transitioned from being a parochial, unsophisticated field to a vibrant and highly sophisticated field of investigation. So, dear students, to conclude, the discipline of comparative politics is very dynamic in nature. Comparative politics, by necessitating comparison, helps us to find out various ways in which politics operates and provides with the diversity of alternatives that exist in the world. Comparative political analysis always remains creative, self-reflective, open and critical. While the earliest studies concerned themselves with observing and classifying governments and regimes, comparative politics in the late 19th and early 20th century was concerned with studying the formal legal structures of institutions in the Western countries. And towards the end of Second World War, a number of new nations emerged on the world scene. So, the dominance of liberalism was challenged by the emergence of communism and the powerful presence of Soviet Union on the world system. The concern among comparativists changed at this juncture and shifted toward studying the diversity of political behaviors and processes which were thrown up, however, within a single overarching framework. The concept of systems, structures and functions came in vogue. These frameworks were used by Western scholars, particularly those in the United States, to study phenomena like developmentalism, modernization and so on. However, in the late 1980s, focus of studying politics comparatively within an overarching framework of system declined and regional systematic studies assumed significance. These studies started focusing again on the study of state, political forms and power structures within civil society, which had suffered a setback earlier with the arrival of systems and structural functions into comparative politics. Later, collapse of USSR, dominance of liberal democracy, capitalism and the emergence of concept of globalization in 1980s led comparativists into adopting universalistic homogenizing expressions like transition to democracy, the global market and civil society. The reorientation of comparative politics resulted in an expansion of the subdiscipline in terms of theoretical depth and empirical scope as attempts were made to integrate a growing but disparate body of knowledge by means of theory. It is in this context that the vibrant and highly sophisticated discipline in terms of concepts, theories and methods emerged, and that is how the subject of comparative politics looks like today. So, dear students, let us end here. I hope you would have enjoyed this lecture. Goodbye and take care.